If you're a subscriber to Zeteo, as I know you all must be, then chances are you're well aware of Project 2025. Yes, the dangerous far-right policy agenda that Trump is desperately trying to deny involvement with, despite over 140 of his former staffers having worked on it. And the DNC were focused on it too last month in Chicago, with Democrats zooming in on the bits from it that they think voters will be most concerned about, like the project's plan to create backdoor abortion bans and the vast expansion of presidential powers, both of which are indeed major threats to our democracy and to our rights. But what they're not really mentioning is how this is more than just a plan from the MAGA masterminds. It's also from and for the country's ultra-rich oligarchs. I'm talking about people like the Koch family, the oil billionaires, famous for using dark money to kill climate action time after time. I'm talking about the groups run by people like Leonard Leo, who, with the help of billionaire donors like Harlan Crow, Paul Singer, and yes, the Koch family, used his influence over Trump to create the Supreme Court's current conservative supermajority. Leo and the Koch family are just a few of the big money meddlers who have already helped funnel millions into Project 2025. On top of their donations, The Lever has also reported that the Heritage Foundation, aka the organization behind Project 2025, has received over $18 million from Wall Street's donor-advised funds since 2020, and that number is only continuing to increase. Now, whether or not all that support is the cause or the consequence of Project 2025's plan to water down campaign finance laws, one thing is for sure: those dark money oligarchs are becoming more and more successful when it comes to thwarting our democracy and its rules. That's exactly what former senior communications advisor and speechwriter to the Bernie Sanders campaign and founder and editor-in-chief for The Lever, David Sirota, exposes in his excellent new investigative podcast series, Master Plan. The show takes you through a decades-long scheme to effectively legalize corruption in the United States of America, and David Sirota joins me now. David, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
David, when people talk about the normalization of dark money and billionaire influence in our politics, they tend to go back to the Citizens United Supreme Court decision from 2010. But when you talk about all this corruption in Master Plan, you go back even further. Where do you start the clock when you look at the timeline of this corrupt influence on our election system?
The early 1970s is where all this really started. There was the Watergate scandal, which was basically the first major campaign finance scandal of the modern era. I think a lot of people know about the break-in. They don't know that corporate money, illegal, secret corporate money, funded part of the break-in, and executives were prosecuted at the time. And after that came the post-Watergate campaign finance reforms. But at the same time that was happening, those victories were happening, there was a guy named Lewis Powell. He was the head of the American Bar Association, a tobacco industry lawyer, who wrote a memo for the Chamber of Commerce that was a directive that corporations needed to do a much better job of essentially owning the government, because the government had become too democratically responsive to the public. And what ended up coming out of that was a series of task forces that included some of the executives of the top biggest corporations in the country, and they focused on taking over the judiciary and deregulating the campaign finance system. So baked into the post-Watergate campaign finance reforms, as one example, were the loopholes that created corporate PACs in the first place, an explosion of corporate PACs. What came out of that, the conservative legal movement from the Powell memo, was the case, what was then a radical idea, that money in politics isn't corruption. Money in politics is constitutionally protected speech, the Buckley v. Valeo case. And also what came out of that was that Lewis Powell, soon after writing the memo, was installed on the Supreme Court, where he engineered a ruling after Buckley v. Valeo, which says money is not only constitutionally protected speech, but corporations have a right to those free speech protections when spending in elections. That decision, authored by Lewis Powell, the creator of the Powell memo, became the basis for Citizens United. So the point is that this is a long plan implemented to focus on deregulating the campaign finance system, ending the anti-corruption and anti-bribery laws. And you may ask why? Why would they want to do that? Because in a one-person, one-vote democracy, it's much harder for oligarchs and corporations to pass the unpopular self-enriching policies they want. They need to use the thing that they have the most of, money, to rig that and short circuit that process.
So just on the money and the short circuiting, and thank you for that summary. Let's now look at what's happening today based on what started in the 70s. We have Project 2025. We have the Heritage Foundation, which has got a lot of money, as your news outfit, The Lever, has reported. Wall Street has donated millions to the Heritage Foundation, which then gives Trump Project 2025. What specifically, obviously we know what generally you mentioned, but what specifically is in it for Wall Street here? What are they going to get out of this?
It's a great question. I mean, there's all sorts of efforts to rescind the regulatory regime, the frankly weak regulatory regime that exists to regulate banks and financial institutions. Stuff like how much money you have to keep in reserve, capital requirements and the like, how much federal regulatory oversight on what kinds of investments you're making. Same thing with the SEC. And I should mention that this all, Project 2025 directly goes back to the same plan we're talking about. The Powell memo inspired the seed funding for the Heritage Foundation, the major donor, a guy named Joe Kors. We uncovered that. Others have noted that. And the Heritage Foundation found its niche in creating these long, detailed policy templates for Republican presidents. Project 2025 is the 9th iteration of what it was called Mandate for Leadership. And the reason to be concerned about it is because when we've seen other Republican presidents come into office, they have used Mandate for Leadership to implement these policies. This is not just like pie in the sky stuff. The Project 2025 in the Mandate for Leadership series is designed to be implemented on day one.
And as we say, we've talked a lot about the implications for abortion rights, for the DOJ. A lot of that is getting a lot of play, and it should. But you're one of the few people sounding the alarm saying, actually, this is really going to be a gift to billionaires coming off the back of a Biden presidency, which, for all its many faults, did a lot of good stuff on the domestic front, from the Inflation Reduction Act to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act to the American Rescue Plan, and obviously building on the Obama Affordable Care Act.
Absolutely. I mean, the Biden administration on domestic economics has been the best domestic economic policies in really 50 years.
Yep.
And look, the inflation is a serious problem, but when you look at the FTC, the CFPB, labor policy, the American Rescue Plan, I mean, it's so much better than what has come in the last 50 years. Now you could say, well, that's more a referendum on how bad the policies have been over the last 50 years.
But life is relative, yeah.
Exactly, it's undeniable. And Project 2025 is an attempt to revert all of that.
So we've seen big money involved in our elections for many years. In the most recent primary cycles, we've seen AIPAC, for example, the very powerful pro-Israel lobbying group, managing to oust two very progressive members of Congress, two critics of Israel, Jamal Bowman, Cori Bush. I think they spent something like $23 million in those two races combined, more than many foreign countries spend on their entire elections in these two districts. What do you think the Democratic Party can do, should do in response to groups like AIPAC almost buying elections, some might argue?
It's a really difficult quandary. I think first and foremost, there needs to be public financing of elections. Bernie Sanders mentioned this at the Democratic Convention. It seems like a pie in the sky idea, but it is fundamental to our democracy, which is to say, there should be a way for people to run for office where they can have adequate resources to run a serious political campaign, and adequate resources that aren't from private sources that are coming with the expectations of government favors. Right now, because of the master plan, the deregulated campaign finance system forces candidates to rely on private sources and allows essentially billionaires and wealthy special interests to buy these elections. Public financing of elections has passed in other states. It's been supported by Democrats. If you want to make a more level playing field, it's not going to be perfect, but a more level playing field, this is essential.
So isn't the real evil genius of the master plan that it isn't just focused on Republicans, right? Corporate interests have managed to get both parties on board with their deregulatory small government agendas. The Democratic Party, parts of it, are also beholden to oligarchs, billionaires, big donors. There was a fascinating moment, revealing moment at the DNC where Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker took the stage just before your old boss, Senator Bernie Sanders, and joked about being a billionaire and got huge applause from the crowd. Like, billionaires not all baddies if they're happen to be a Democratic governor. And of course, the Democrats themselves get a lot of corporate PAC money. Can the Democrats be the party then that reforms this system?
It's a really good question. I think the answer is it's hard to really say. One thing that can be said is that the Democrats have sponsored, for instance, the Disclose Act, which would require better disclosure of anonymous money flooding into politics. It's been the Democrats who have co-sponsored bills like a public financing bill. But I think it's an entirely fair question to ask: can a party that is dependent as much as the Republican Party on oligarch and big money, will that party really want to reform the system? I would just say this, that I think it's possible, but it's going to require a reform movement. I think back to John McCain in 2000, a Republican, where he raised this issue of corporate money and corruption in politics to such a national level that it compelled the human personification of money in politics, George W. Bush, to sign campaign finance reform. And that happened because he galvanized public support for it. The question is there a similar set of leaders in the Democratic Party willing to galvanize that support for the same kind of cause? I don't know the answer to that.
Last question. We talk about the Democrats, but ultimately, you know, the master plan is about the Republicans. It is about right-wing billionaires. Our most famous right-wing billionaire, Elon Musk, is now being touted for a position in government in a future Trump administration. He says he can't wait to help Donald Trump cut government spending and inefficiency and waste in 2025. What does it say to you about our political moment right now that someone like Musk, who's so unashamed of his billionaire status, just buys Twitter, rebrands it as X, turns it into a vehicle for the right, talks openly about, you know, there's reporting, he's denying it, about spending money on trying to elect Trump, and of course him wanting to work for Trump, which he's open about. What does it say about our political moment that this guy is still seen as some sort of hero, genius, someone to emulate and aspire to be in America in 2024 by vast sections of the populace? Including many liberals.
This is the danger of normalizing corruption. There's legalizing corruption, where we deregulate the campaign finance laws. The Supreme Court says essentially bribery is legal. But there's normalizing it, where we as a culture and a society say this kind of corruption, where, for instance, somebody like Elon Musk says he's going to give millions of dollars to Donald Trump and then is asking for things from Donald Trump, or Donald Trump is running out and saying to oil billionaires or companies, give me your money and I'll give you climate policy. When we say that this is no longer corruption, this is just what politics is, that is going to be the barrier to any kind of reform movement. Because if it's like the David Foster Wallace speech about the fish. Two fish are swimming along. One fish says, "Hey, how do you think the water is today?" And the other fish says, "What is water?" If corruption becomes the water, where we don't even recognize it as anything outrageous or anything unacceptable, then it is true, the master plan will win. But I don't think it has to go that way. Maybe I'm an eternal optimist. I still think that a lot of Americans, and the polls show it, a lot of Americans don't think this is acceptable, but they're waiting for leadership to galvanize a more of a movement to say, here is how it can be fixed and fought.
Well, I'm not an optimist, David, but I am hopeful, and I stay hopeful. Thank you for joining me. Master Plan is currently at the top of the charts for news and politics on Apple Podcasts, and you can listen to it on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcast. David Sirota, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to Zeteo.com. Your support matters.